Mr. Kant, you're there, right there. And Yasmin, I'm going to turn it to you. Last 10 minutes, we'll take some questions and collect them, 3 or 4 of them, and come back to the panelists for their final words. You have 50 minutes.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Samir. Welcome, everybody, to this session, which is called Solving the Energy Trilemma: Access, Affordability, and Availability. Despite what it says in your program, that this session is going to be about managing the energy transition, I think really the subtext is that this is the finance and economics session of the conference, and we have nobody better than our panelists here to take us through what that challenge looks like and hopefully share a set of solutions that we can talk through and exchange views on today. We have 5 esteemed speakers. I will quickly introduce all of them. Mr. Amitabh Kant, who's India's G20 Sherpa, and congratulations for the work last year in particular. Next, we have Ms. Gwendolyn Abuna, who's the Managing Director of EcoBank in Cameroon. We have Dr. Nalini Thavisin, Advisor to the Thai Prime Minister and Thailand's Trade Representative. Mr. Fahad Al-Dubaib, who's a Senior VP of Strategy and Market Analysis at Saudi Aramco. And last but not least, Lord Nick Stern, Chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Nalini, to ask us to please share with us how progress on solving the energy trilemma is looking in Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. On the Southeast Asia front, I'd like to say that, we have an immense amount of sun, wind, and biomass, and hydro resources. So I think for the renewable energy side, Southeast Asia is very much, has a lot of potential there. And renewable energy investment is quite important there. And in order for that to happen, I think the government has to play a quite vital role in the feed-in tariffs, in giving incentives to make these investments possible and more the transition towards that more smooth. Another issue would be the energy transition process in the Southeast Asia environment. So the government could have a range of policies, and it's important that the policies are convenient for the private sector to also get involved in, and we need the stability of those incentives as well. Another important thing would be the subsidies required for the renewable energy, and also reducing subsidies for the fossil fuel energy front so that people will be able to transit into the renewable energies in the Southeast Asian countries. I think that would help immensely because of the cost involved. Having said that, I think the cost of the solar photovoltaics in the past decade has come down by almost 90%. So in regards to that, I think it's more acceptable anyway in those regards. Another important thing would be the public-private partnerships. That is most crucial, in fact, because it would be mobilizing capital towards the energy infrastructure projects. And government could also engage with the large corporations and private investors through the PPPs to develop, finance, and also operate the energy projects in the renewable energy facilitation, generation facilities, in the transmission lines, and in the distribution networks as well. So this will be sharing risks and also benefits between the public and private sectors. And the fourth point that's crucial is also the technology transfer and capacity building. Because I think that's important for this to take off the ground and to be well accepted. Technology transfer and capacity building is really essential for the acceleration of the adoption rate of clean energy and clean technology in the Southeast Asia region. Government could facilitate by the partnership with international organizations, multilateral banks, research institutions, technology providers, and of course what's important also is the technology licensing agreement that would be required with the joint research and development initiatives that would help. So this would be in the capacity building arena to help take this off in the Southeast Asia region. The fifth point would be the regulatory framework. I think this is also very important to have people have that confidence of investing or getting involved in the renewable energy front in the Southeast Asia region. I think we need like transparent and predictable regulations, clear indications of the tariffs, clear indications of what is involved, and the stability of all these investments as well. And I think what is crucial in this period, in this age, is the financial instruments that are required for the investment in this renewable energy, green bonds, green financing. I think this would unlock additional capital for renewable energy projects by aligning the financial flows with the sustainability projects of the renewable energy. So carbon financing mechanisms such as carbon credits can offset the additional revenue streams for renewable energy as well. So in general, I think in order to generate a positive impact of
that capital for investment, can you just tell us what is happening in Thailand in this respect specifically, please?
Thank you. In Thailand, actually, at this time, we realize the importance of private investment, and we welcome all foreign investors to join us in developing clean energy projects to fulfill the net zero goal. So we have a large potential of clean energy resources across the country, and in Thailand, we provide supportive measures, financial instruments, and incentives to facilitate foreign investment on clean energy. And right now, we have a new scheme called the RE100 companies to invest in Thailand. And this focuses on the utility green tariff, or we call it the UGT, which also helps Thailand to facilitate and promote mobilization of green investment into this area. That means that we would serve the demand of industries and consumers who require clean electricity for their carbon reduction targets and carbon tracking process for all their products. And we believe that this, the measures of this will be announced very soon in Thailand, and it'll help industries to access clean, reliable, affordable energy and to achieve their carbon emission reduction targets as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Nalini. Moving to a bit east or west rather, to Saudi Arabia. Mr. Fahad, you're a representative of a large energy and chemicals company. One of the challenges you're facing is the growing demand. There's an estimated 6 billion new consumers coming online. Can you talk to us a bit about how, from your perspective, you're thinking about this energy trilemma, and in particular, what progress you're making on solving it?
Thank you for your question. I think before we talk about the next 6 billion, let's focus on the next 2 billion. We believe that the world needs to focus on the energy addition as well as the energy transition. People will continue to demand energy and affordable energy. I think we've seen over the past 2 years that too much focus on one aspect of the energy trilemma triangle can be consequential. We've seen when the world lost 6% of their gas supplies, how prices went up sevenfold, and almost all forms of energy were in demand, and businesses were squeezed, and consumers were impacted. We in Aramco are trying to solve two big challenges. How can we continue to satisfy the growing energy demand needed to fuel economies? And how can we decarbonize the current energy system? On the first, we're expanding our gas capacity to displace a lot of the fuels we're consuming. But on the second, Aramco has a leading position in terms of its carbon intensity. We have the lowest upstream carbon intensity amongst the leading businesses. We have near zero methane intensity, but we're not stopping there. We are getting into carbon capture and sequestration. We're developing a 6 million ton per annum carbon capture facility. We're investing in renewables. We're getting into hydrogen as well. And we're also pushing the envelope on energy efficiency, which we believe is a big low-hanging fruit that can be capitalized. I believe the focus for the next 2 billion and possibly 6 billion should be the global south. Much of the growing energy demand will be coming from the global south. So we need to think of the different speeds and requirements for the global south. Some of the countries need the jobs, need to industrialize before they can evolve into the services sectors, and some of them need the money to invest in new energies. So it is imperative that we think, we don't approach it in a one policy fits all. We need to look at each country or each region with its unique requirements and always try to strike the right balance between affordability, accessibility, and sustainability to ensure that the transition is orderly.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Mrs. Gwendolyn to continue the sort of jurisdictional question, Mr. Fahad, that you pointed out that each country is different. Ms. Gwendolyn, you're the MD of a large financial institution in Cameroon. Can you talk to us about the role that you're playing and your institution can play in solving this trilemma of increasing demand, access, as well as availability and affordability?
Thank you. I would like to just set the foundation by saying that when you look at the commercial banking or the financial institution space in countries like ours, we're still at a very plain vanilla level where we have short-term capital. There's liquidity in the market, but it's very short-term. So to be able to finance green projects, you need a whole shift in the financial architecture from the commercial banks to the regulators to the government. And I think all parties have to work together for it to come to pass. Right now, there's a lot of projects that are available, whether it's hydro, solar, wind, you name it. There is that possibility. But can it be financed by the commercial banks locally? I would say no, because there's short-term capital. So the government has it on the agenda. They are working with MDBs and other potential investors who are interested in financing some of these hydro projects that are going to be used to create or generate more electricity, and other partners that are willing to finance the solar investments that are needed. But it is not sufficient, and it is not going at the scale that we need to be able to meet these net zero targets. So what do I recommend? I think that, first of all, the public sector has to adjust its policies to incite more investors to come. Because if we continue to have the same regulation, the same policies that do not favor investors to come into this market, we are not going to see change. Secondly, the government also has to decide or change, and this is governments for all of Central Africa and even West Africa, because all of Central Africa, we have the same central bank. We have one central bank, we have one regulator, and the same with the West African countries. All 7 or 8 of them have the same central bank, the same regulator, and the government policies are very similar. So I think that if the governments can adjust their policies to be more favorable for investors, there will be traction. Secondly, the NDBs have to come up. They keep looking at the political risk, which is normal, the credit risk of the government, but they have to look at it on a global scale of how can we help to this transition, which is necessary for the African continent. We also are going to depend on philanthropists. To be realistic, philanthropists who are interested in financing the green transition also have to step in. And we are seeing a lot of them coming in, be it for the blue economy as well as the green economy. So collaboration from the private and public sector is key for us to make traction. We are seeing financial institutions coming up with blue bonds, sovereign bonds to finance this transition, but the size and the frequency is not sufficient for us to scale.
Thank you. Do you mind if I come back with a follow-up? Because I think this is a similar theme to the Thai context about enabling policies from government being important. Hopefully we'll hear next from Lord Stern about the importance of the domestic resources to be mobilized into meeting the increasing demand and solving this energy trilemma. You're also the president of the Banking Association of Cameroon. Could you give us a few specifics of what kind of policies you'd want to see from government that would help you play a stronger role in this transition?
It would be good to see some guarantees coming from the government. The government of Cameroon, as well as most of the governments in Central Africa, do not give guarantees. They seem to prefer for the banks to look for foreign guarantors for financing in country, and I think that they also have to take responsibility and be engaged and provide those types of guarantees. We have seen guarantees coming for small and medium-sized enterprise financing, but we do not see guarantees coming for green projects. They also have to change the fiscal policies, because to incentivize investors, they have to be fiscal policies and other regulations that favor, if you're going to bring in equipment, if you're going to bring in foreign capital, the FX regulation has to adjust to make that favorable. Right now, the foreign exchange regulation that we have is very inhibitive for investors. When you bring in foreign capital, you have to get approval from the central bank, and after your investment, you have to get approval to take out your dividend payment. This is not favorable, and they have to change that to incite investors to come up. And we have to work. We have been working with the IMF, with the World Bank, and they have come out with a long list of fiscal adjustments. I would not want to say also aspects on our regulatory policies that have to change to make sure that investors feel comfortable. We also have to have the government change or educate or provide, I would say, measures for us to talk about carbon markets, because there's no discussion about carbon markets in our economy. So if you have investors that are looking for carbon credits or can get carbon credits if they invest in countries, the country has to be able to give regulations that support that carbon credit. So there are a lot of measures such as this that we would like to put on the table, or we are already putting on the table, to see how the government can step in to make the countries more attractive for investors around the green transition.
Thank you. It's fantastic to really hear these specifics, because I think we've come quite a long way in the broad conversation that we all need finance, and today we're in an action zone and need the solutions, and for the governments to hear that and respond. We're going to zoom out from the country specifics. Nick, you wrote a report and was part of the G20 expert group on reform of multilateral development banks and overall the role of finance and economics in the transition, looking at the global south, and of course working closely with the G20 presidency to bring the conversation back to our host country. I'm not going to ask you to summarize the whole report, because you don't have enough time to do that, but can you please share some of the key highlights that everybody should be aware of in terms of how overall as a global kind of collaborative, we're going to actually fix this problem?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us. I want to set this in the context of what we're trying to do, which is the drive to net zero, but seeing that as building sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth. This is the growth story of the 21st century. Much more attractive than the dirty, destructive models we've followed in the past. But we have to invest a lot to get there. This is about investment, systemic change, structural change, and we have to work very hard to realize this growth story, and there'll be quite a lot of difficulties along the way. But we have to recognize it for what it is, a very attractive, different form of growth. The investment that we need is major, probably 2 to 3 percentage points extra of GDP of the world as a whole, more in emerging markets and developing countries. That is perfectly possible. Investment rates have been in the past a good deal higher than they are now, and the slow growth of the world economy is largely to do with the fact that we have not, as a world, invested enough. So this is feasible, but it does, and we must be very clear on that, mean a ramp up in investment. That means creating the conditions for investment, as Nalini and Gwen have already emphasized, the investment climate, the country platform within which people invest. That's a crucial part of the story, including in the power sector, of course, things like feed-in tariffs, confidence in your revenues, confidence that you'll be able to get the investment done. And it will be cheaper electricity, and it will be more reliable electricity in the sense that you're not dependent on the world markets for imports of fossil fuels. India, of course, particularly dependent on the imports of fossil fuels. How will that be financed? Well, we worked, and the numbers for the report which N.K. Singh and Larry Summers chaired at the invitation of the Indian G20, and let me pay tribute here with everybody here to what India did in the G20. It was absolutely outstanding, and Amitabh, our friend here, was at the core of all that. India set the agenda. The agenda was about sustainable, resilient, inclusive development, and it took it a very long way. In that, N.K. Singh, Larry Summers led a report. I was part of that, and Veera Songway and I and Amar Bhattacharya led a report for the COPs. So let me just summarize the numbers in the small amount of time I've got left. For emerging markets and developing economies outside China, China doesn't need the finance. We estimated that the flow of investment for climate finance would have to be around $2.4 trillion a year in that set of countries in 2030. The whole path matters, but to be specific, let me just speak about 2030. That climate finance is the energy transition, it's adaptation, it's natural capital, loss and damage, and so on. So within that 2.4 trillion, about 1.5 trillion is the energy sector. But let me talk about the 2.4 trillion. We reckon that roughly 1.4 trillion would have to be financed domestically. That's partly public and partly domestic private saving and the capital markets. But 1 trillion flow externally. Of that 1 trillion flow externally, given that they're very different kinds of projects which need different kind of finance, we reckon that you'd probably get a little over half of that 1 trillion from the private sector. Something like 300, of that 1 trillion external, something like half would be, what, 550 billion from the private sector, 300 billion or so from the multilateral development banks, and then the remaining 150, 200 billion from highly concessional finance, ODA, voluntary carbon markets, new forms of international taxation, SDRs, and so on, and philanthropy. So that's, broadly speaking, the 4 elements, and they combine in different ways for different projects. If you're talking about electricity generation, it could be mostly private sector. If you're talking about dealing with the dislocation associated with closing coal mines, investing in people and places, that would have to be almost zero cost capital, not debt service. So the combinations of those four things, it's not simply that they add up to the 2.4 trillion with the 1 trillion external, of course. It's how they combine together. And the key thing there is to bring down the risks and bring down the cost of capital. Because, and let me finish with this, solar beats fossil fuel in much of Africa for electricity generation in terms of price, but only if the cost of capital is 7 or 8%. Much of Africa would be paying 20% for a cost of capital, and it doesn't beat out fossil fuels at that price. So that cost of capital. So the job that we have to do, manage the risks, create the investment environment, and bring down that cost of capital so that what is genuinely economically clean, cheaper than the dirty, becomes also financially clean, being cheaper than the dirty. But the prize is this new growth story, cities where you can move and breathe and be productive. We kill people 5 or 10 million a year from air pollution, most of it from the burning, not all of it, but most of it from the burning of fossil fuels. Energy efficiency. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. This would be focusing the areas where innovation is moving in a very rapid way. Whichever way you look at it, if we get this right, it's a tremendously attractive growth story. We've got to invest a lot, and we've got to find a lot of the finance in the right packages for that investment so the cost of capital is manageable.
Thank you, Nick, for not just for the thoughts, but also for synthesizing that so quickly and so eloquently for our audience. I have a cheeky follow-up.
Can I just add that you asked me about the NK Singh, Larry Summers thing on the MDBs.
Yeah.
And the number I gave, which I did give, about 300 billion or so, would mean tripling the financing from the MDBs. That's perfectly possible, and with the paid-in capital, it's very cheap. If you sweat their balance sheets a bit better, you can absolutely get there. It's totally feasible. But tripling the finance from the MDBs and working much more closely with the private sector is what we would be looking for. That's why we called that report with NK Singh, Larry Summers, bigger, bolder, better. Bigger times 3, bolder, more work with the private sector and taking more risk, and better, just being more easy to work with than sometimes the MDBs have been in the past.
Thank you. We're going to come back to the MDB question in a minute. My cheeky question. So about half of the 1 trillion of flow that you talked about needs to come externally into developing countries. And we've had a big focus on the global south here, which is right and fine. The growth story and looking for economic growth is everywhere, right? And a lot of that finance is going to have to come from developed countries. And so I wonder if you just have a word. We also have European representatives here in the audience. How are developed countries thinking about that? And I'm not just talking about the failed 100 billion, right, through the COP process, but is it realistic that that money is going to come from the global north and those advanced economies? And how do they need to think about this investment?
Well, the overall flow of 1 trillion a year by 2030 into emerging markets, developing economies outside China, is obviously a major step up. Key in that story was the tripling of the MDBs, because the private sector is not going in anything like the scale that it needs to. No, the private sector flows that we're talking about, 10, 15 times more than they are now. It's a really major step up. Why aren't they going? It's because of the perceived risk. Sometimes the risk is real, sometimes it's just perceived, but it's a bit of each. But the challenge is to bring down that risk. That means creating the investment conditions. That's for the country itself, but working with, co-creating with its private sector those conditions. It's the private sector who understand what the problems are. It's the governments that can fix them. If they can get together, with some help from the MDBs, they can create those conditions. But also, it is the kind of capital that comes in. People are looking for guarantees to bring down risk. They're looking for equity investments. And we need an MDB system that can actually provide that risk management, I say through guarantees, equities, much longer term loans, and so on, turning over their capital so that they can expand much more quickly. And that's the kind of MDB system we need. I think Ajay Banga at the World Bank is looking to build that, and I think it's very important that the emerging market developing economies push very hard for that. The cost of that, in terms of paid-in capital, would be really quite small, and that we've run some of those numbers, and it is the kind of thing that they
very leveraged.
Yeah, you've got very big multipliers in there, and if you take the paid-in multiplier to the overall capital, if you see the bigger use of guarantees and so on, the kind of expansion we've described is perfectly feasible and involves minimal amounts of money paid into the MDBs.
Thank you. Last but not least, Mr. Amitabh Kant, we're privileged to have you in general on this panel, but also because I hope you'll bring us some of the experience of your enormous role sherping a very important G20 last year. The energy trilemma, it's really international, it's global. Not one country can do it on its own. Last night, I got to cheat and listen to you speaking last night already. So you used green hydrogen as an example that even if India's prioritizing and trying to push this as a solution, you can't do it on your own. Can you share with us what it was like trying to make progress on this trilemma through the G20 last year, and what hope do we have that more progress can really be made in a multilateral forum like that for problems and the solutions that come with them that are truly global?
Well, thanks. During G20, one of our key priorities, we got a consensus on just about all issues, but I think the key consensus was on the Green Development Pact. And this was critical because if you look at 80% of the global population today is living in countries which are net importers of fossil fuel. According to IRENA, you can have a scenario by 2050 when 90% of the energy requirement of the world can be met from renewables. So first and foremost, I think each one of the countries need to push for renewables because many of the countries of the global south are climatically blessed. Now, the challenge is that when you push for renewables, you need, firstly, policy framework in these countries. Secondly, you need technology. And thirdly, you need finances. Let me touch upon each one of these. And I'm speaking from India's experience of having established 185 gigawatts of renewable energy and being the only G20 country which achieved its NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. The challenge on finance is that there is no shortage of funds in the world. There is $300 trillion available, $150 trillion with sovereign wealth funds and private equity. The challenge is that there are different risks. Money is available to the developed world at 2%. It's available to India at 8%. To African countries, it's available at 16%. To sub-Saharan countries, it's available at 22%. That makes projects in Africa, sub-Saharan countries, commercially non-viable. You need an agency which can globally de-risk many of these international projects, and there should be a global de-risking. The challenge is that multilateral financial institutions were made during the post-Bretton Woods World War II period when there was no challenge of climate. Today's challenge is climate, and therefore institutions like World Bank need to become climate banks, and they need to de-risk some of these projects. And for them, the World Bank raises only 0.6 cents to a dollar it lends. It needs to raise 5x more from the private capital which is available in the world. It should be the de-risking institution for the world. It should use MEGA and many other instruments of blended finance, first loss guarantees, credit enhancement in favor of the global south. So that's the key challenge which N.K. Singh, Larry Summers' report, which Nick spoke about, really says that the role of international financial institutions need to be redesigned, restructured for the world of climate change. Second is policy frameworks. Without creating the right policy frameworks and allowing private sector to come in a big way, it will not be possible for us to achieve renewables. And therefore, in India's case, it's the private sector, because of a good policy framework, which has led this. And private sector has been able to raise a lot of finance from both private equity and from international financial institutions in India. But that has happened because the policy framework has been right. And in many of these countries, this policy framework needs to be put right, which to my mind is very important. But the important thing to my mind is that even if we are able to convert all our electricity into energy, that's only 20% of our energy. There are hard-to-abate sectors like coal, steel, cement, fertilizer, refineries. All these need to be moved from hard-to-abate fossil fuel to clean energy. And that is 80% of the global energy. Now, even today, look at India, we import worth about $180 to $200 billion worth of fossil fuel. And our objective is that by 2047, when we become 100, we should be an exporter of clean energy. The only way the world can do it is by producing green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is by producing renewables, cracking water through electrolyzer, and producing green hydrogen. And the challenge is that countries like United States, which have accounted for all the greenhouse gas emission in the world, and which today are practicing protectionism through CHIPS Act and IRA, should open it out to allow the world to move towards green hydrogen. And that will ensure cleaning up of hard-to-abate sector. And third is biofuel can be a very big driver of creating jobs, creating employment, and using much of the biomass of the agriculture and other waste areas into producing clean fuel. Brazil is a great example of what it has achieved through biofuel. And fourthly, I've been always, and I repeatedly saying this, that the big technological disruption that will happen will be through the small modular reactors, which will enable us to produce clean energy and meet base loads, and enable us to really do good clean nuclear energy at low cost will be through small modular reactor, for which policy needs to be put in place so that nuclear waste can be handled. So my view is that there is no shortage of financial resources. There is no shortage of climatic conditions. All the global south countries have the climatic conditions. They can produce 90% of the energy. You need reforms in the multilateral and international financial institutions to enable resources to flow in, and you need the right policy framework by countries, which India has demonstrated is possible. But the future has to be to go green. Countries will achieve values. Countries will be able to attract capital if they go green in the future, and we'll be able to give a better quality of life for our citizens by not repeating the mistakes which the western part of the world has done while industrializing and manufacturing. The global south must take a different approach, which will be a sustainable approach, which is a doable approach, and that is what India aims at. And the last point I want to make is that there is a need for changing our lifestyles and nudging people into behavioral change, which is what Lifestyle for Environment, which Prime Minister Modi has talked about, that if we are able to nudge people into becoming pro-planet people by switching off lights, by ensuring that water taps don't flow, by consuming less fossil fuel, we are saving 21% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a high note to end on. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I hope there are some mics going around. Can we have the two from over there, please? And then there was one here in the front row. Can you please, are there mics? Mics up at the front. Please, can we have the two from the back? Please state your name, affiliation, and question rather than statement. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Roberto Italia, researcher at the Geoeconomic Center of Italian think tank ISPI. I have two questions. The first of all is what about nuclear energy? If investments in nuclear are necessary at this point in time from a cost of capital perspective. And the second one is about external financing needs from emerging markets. How can we avoid currency risk when it comes to green bonds, blue bonds, or something? Because I think this kind of instruments will be denominated in dollars to attract private capital investment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kira Finke from the German Council on Foreign Relations, and my question goes to Gwendolyn Abunaf. What would you like to see come out of the COP29 in Baku that would help your bank finance renewable energies? And to Nick Stern, should Europe see Baltic North Sea offshore wind as a security project? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, good morning. I'm Rahul Banerjee. I'm the Managing Director at Raisina House. We are a policy think tank based out of India and specialize in foreign policy planning. Now, a lot of conversation has been happening about green transition and securitizing this green transition, but a focus has to be given on the Pacific Island nations as well as the Caribbeans. How does an energy transition look like over there, especially in island nations where solar might not be a viable option because of the land area it covers? Thank you.
Thank you. Panel, the questions were around nuclear investment, affordability, cost of capital. How do we mitigate against currency risk? COP29 expectations or ideal outcomes. The Baltic offshore wind, is that a security project? And then what about the island nations? I'm going to open it up to the panel. Who wants to come in on what? Ms. Gwendolyn.
I will leave the nuclear question for experts, and I will go to the currency risk. It's for our region, most of our currencies are pegged. So in the Central African region, the currency, the CFA, is pegged to the euro. And in the past, a lot of the foreign bonds that we have been done in euros, so they are euro denominated. So this helps to hedge the risk because the currencies are pegged. So that's the point I can say there. Increasingly, we are looking for projects or supporters or investors that can help de-risk, because the major risk, like I mentioned, is the risk attached to the project. So if we can get investors that can help to de-risk this project, I think like Nick was mentioning, this would also help us around what we can do next. Expectations for COP28, I think it's more, COP29, it's really around, I would say, how can the carbon credits really come into play? Because if the carbon credits can really come into play, particularly in the developing countries, I think this would really support the way forward. So for me, that is really the major take, I would say, for COP29. And having more, I think Nick also mentioned, having more of the NDBs come up, but at the same time having our governments also come up with the policy changes that are required to make the necessary options come to play. That's what I would think.
Thank you. How about, does anybody want to come in on the islands question? Island nations?
I'll take that. By going back to my earlier comment that we need to look at each country and its energy mix and its development required specifically. There is no one solution that cuts all for every country. Even renewables, sometimes availability can be costly for some countries, and we need to be mindful of all of that. And this is where we have to be focusing on the emissions in the first place, and then the most feasible and economical alternatives that are available. Yes, renewable are there and everyone is scaling it, but we also need to be mindful of the cost where you're deploying all of that. Each country should have its own energy mix informed by economics and the customers' requirements, whether it's businesses or consumers and their level of income.
If I could pick up on the questions around offshore wind and the countries which don't have so much land. I mean, Bangladesh, for example, have a lot of pressure on their land, and the viability of solar in those kinds of environments. And I think we ought to think of those questions as essentially one question, is that if you are looking for energy security, you want to have quite a lot of alternatives. So the UK, before long, I hope, will have a cable to Morocco. We're quite closely linked to French nuclear. We're quite closely linked to Norway. We should have a line to Iceland so that the geothermal is available. In this area, in Nepal, you can have a lot of potential for exporting hydroelectricity to India. India could have a lot of potential for exporting solar energy to Bangladesh. So our security comes from a diversification of our links. And that kind of linkage, I think, is going to be very important regionally. In Europe, you've got, of course, as the question embodies, lots of wind in the north and lots of sun in the south. The center of Spain, the value of land is practically zero. There's lots of it. You should be covering it with solar, importing from North Africa. So that kind of regional link, I think, is going to be the answer to the question, both about offshore wind in the Baltics and about solar in Bangladesh and so on. And it's going to be a crucial part of building this whole new growth story that Amitabh and I were waxing correctly, I think, enthusiastically about. It's that kind of investment, that kind of link up, that's going to build low-cost, secure energy.
So on that nuclear question...
Last word, Mr.
Well, I come to the last word, but on the nuclear question, I think the future is small modular reactors because they are, their capital cost is low. You need nuclear for base load, so that because solar energy is intermittent in nature, and if that's the best, and you can now, it's going to be a big market for the future, small modular reactor, because long nuclear projects have big time and cost overruns. And on the exchange fluctuation question, it's very important that lending is done in local currencies because by international institutions, because it'll be very difficult to meet the exchange fluctuations. But I think the important question is for the global south, that 80% of the carbon space has already been occupied by the developed world. The developed world has now started giving fresh licenses. UK has given fresh license for exploration in the high seas. Germany has gone back to coal. Norway, a country like Norway, has opened up exploration. And that means there'll be very little carbon space left. And I think it's time the world realizes that 1% of the global companies account for about 42% of the greenhouse gas emission. So the world needs to bring out data, and Nick and company should really work on this to bring out data as to who's accounting for greenhouse gas emission, and the markets must penalize those who actually account for this greenhouse gas emission. Because moving from one COP to another COP is not making a difference. The markets must make a difference. You and I must make a difference to every single company which is accounting for greenhouse gas emission in the world.
Thank you for that.